Hey everybody, how's it going? We're back into this whole MTG lore book reading stuff. Um, if Just to refresh your memory, we are doing the Wildered quest, and previously in the last chapter, um, we heard a loud scream in Beckborough, and something happened, and we don't know yet what it is, but I guess we're supposed to find out in this next few chapters. So here it is, chapter 6. A relentless storm had swept in on Wintertide's Eve, and now, mid morning on the first day of winter, showed no sign of letting up. Its winds gusted so violently the massive keep of Castle Ardenvale shook, even though it was built of stone and anchored by the circle of loyalty. Will stood at the back of the great hall, wishing he did not feel so uneasy. Always a popular gathering place during the long dark winter months. The hall was especially crowded today. Queen Linden sat straight back in a modest wooden chair set to the right of the empty high throne. A sword hung on the wall behind the throne. Gold laced its hilt and was inlaid along the incised blade. Older people often spoke of how the blessed sword had once been enchanted, how the gold had glowed with a fiery and blessed light as part of a protective spell woven into the weapon by the questing beast. In the course of the quest for the high throne, the spell had been expended or used up. Now the sword was displayed to remind people that a just, truthful, and loyal individual had proven himself worthy of the honor of ruling the realm as High King. Of course, the questing beast had chosen two candidates to quest for the high rulership and gave each a sword as the mark of its favor. But only one sword was displayed in Castle Ardenvale. Had the questing beast taken back the second blessed sword from Linden when she did not complete the high quest? Had she locked it away herself? No one quite knew. And the only time the twins had asked, their parents had made it clear. The answer was the business of no one except the two who had quested and the beast itself. The queen was surrounded by stewards and clerks, lords and knights and counselors, each waiting their turn to bring yet another crisis to her attention. Yet now she was listening to a bedraggled delegation of villagers who had braved harsh weather to travel all the way from Embereth to seek the High King's aid. A witch had set upon their village a hex that had killed all its fires, forcing its inhabitants to leave rather than freeze. But Embereth's ruling council was too busy arguing over who was responsible for rousing the witch's ire so they could exile such a negligent, reckless individual that they hadn't yet bothered to aid the houseless villagers. The queen's determinedly calm expression never faltered as she gave the report her undivided attention, but at intervals her gaze flashed toward the high throne. In those moments, her shoulders would slump before she recalled herself and sat again with perfect posture. Will sighed, rubbing his eyes. Every day he woke thinking it had all been a terrible dream, and then had to remember all over again. 3 months ago, his father had gone missing at Beckbarrow on the first night of the grand procession. The steward and clerk who had walked with him on his grounds had been found dead in the woods, cleaved by a massive blade. A headache had plagued Will since that night as a persistent reminder of doom and loss. A soft whistle sounded to his left, followed by a low voice. Will! An oil lamp lit the opening of the stairs that linked the main floor of the great hall to a gallery above. Hazel beckoned. She held her sling, which was forbidden to use inside. Before he could scold her, she pressed a finger to her lips and tipped her head toward the throne and the sword. What had she discovered? He padded over. She led him up the stairs, stepping as quietly as she could as they approached the opening. The gallery's balcony surrounded the great hall on three sides. During the cold season, young children often played up here when they couldn't go outside. He paused for his eyes to adjust to the lower level of light. A flashlight light reflecting off polished metal caught his eye. Three young children cowered in the far corner, shrinking away from something he could not discern. Hazel slipped past him, and with the deft movement of constant practice, slung a set of stones down the length of the gallery. Two of the stones clacked against the wall above the children, but one stone came to an abrupt halt in midair and thumped to the floor. Hazel ran down the gallery, slamming to a halt with Will behind her. The tiny body of a blue fairy lay crumpled, mouth pulled back in a rictus grin that revealed the sharpened teeth. The stone lay on one side of the corpse, and a toy griffin carved of wood on the other. "You killed it, Hazel," breathed the smallest child admiringly. "Ash threw the griffin at it, but it wouldn't go away." The fairy's body dissolved into dust, leaving behind its weapon, a pen nib affixed to a toy-like wooden shaft. Will scooped up the nib, careful of its crudely shaped point. "Excellent shot," he said to Hazel. Then to the children, "Have you seen more?" They shook their heads. Toy horses and monsters scattered the floor where they'd been interrupted playing at quest. "How would fairies have gotten inside the castle?" Hazel asked nervously. He glanced around but saw no more of the spiteful winged creatures flitting along the gallery walk intent on mischief. If they were hiding in the shadows of the ceiling beams, he'd never see them unless lamplight reflected off the metal of their stolen weapons. The circle and flame banners hanging from the gallery's railing stirred in an icy draft. Had the fairies cut a way through mortared walls and closed shutters? "Should we tell Mother?" she asked, digging another stone out of her pouch. "She doesn't need to be bothered with this. Ro and I will figure out what to do. Come on." He shepherded the frightened children down the stairs and made sure they scurried into the great hall with its familiar scent of bodies and wool and the reassuring buzz of many people murmuring in solemn voices. When his father sat on the high throne, there were always laughter to be had. Now the mood was glum and fearful. With Hazel still at his heels, he kept descending. The barracks were on the floor below, and since he was headed for the storerooms carved one level deeper into the bedrock, he meant to keep going. But as he reached the landing for the barracks level, low voices caught at his ears, pitched in the tight whispers of compliant and conspiracy. "Convenient for the Queen, isn't it? It makes you wonder, doesn't it?" "What are you saying?" Will halted on the steps, pressing Hazel against the wall as two soldiers walked past along a main passageway. One held a lamp whose light cast wavering stripes through the gap and briefly illuminated Will's boots, but neither of the speakers looked into the stairs shadowed well. "She wanted to be High Queen, not just consort. Now she rules in his absence. Too convenient he disappeared, if you ask me. It is strange. She never completed the high quest," marked the second speaker. "Do you think it's true she murdered the twins' real mother to get Kenrith and power for herself?" Will burst into the corridor, grabbed the man's shoulder to haul him around, and punched him in the face. The man stumbled back and slammed into the wall. "Don't you dare speak of the Queen with such disrespect!" Will spat. A skin of ice rimmed his iron hands. The other man stepped out of reach, palms out. "You can't blame people for wondering how Kenrith vanished for months. They both would have vanished into the wilds for months at a time. That's how questing goes." The man kept on, not taking the hint. "How Kenrith vanished for months and everyone thought he was dead. Yet she's the one who returned carrying twin babies he obviously had sired with a different woman. Queen Linden is my mother, but go ahead, explain to me why you think she isn't." The one he'd hit tested his jaw, saying nothing. The one holding the lamp mouthed words under his breath. Will studied them. They both had gray-streaked blonde hair and bland faces. They might have been kin, or just two undistinguished older men who looked alike. Both wore a soldier's tabard and boots, but neither had a knight's badge. How badly he wanted to meanly point out neither had ever been deemed worthy of even a single knighthood, but his mother would be so disappointed in him if he stooped to childish insults. Still, there were ways to poke sideways to reach the same target. Perhaps you'd like to tell me which of Queen Linden's 4 knightly honors weren't earned, in your opinion, or why the questing beast saw fit to send her on the high quest in the first place. Perhaps you think you know better than the questing beast. They wanted to fight, he could tell by their clenched jaws and flaring nostrils, but they wouldn't. The man who'd been hit said to his companion, "Let's get out of here before we offend the High King's blond son. Can't have that." "You've already offended me," Will snapped. As they began to walk away, the other man cast a retort over his shoulder. "Just because you don't like it doesn't mean people don't think it. They just talk where you can't hear." Their footfalls, and the lamplight faded around a corner, leaving Will and Hazel in darkness. He had to slow his breathing to stop himself from running after them and wrapping them in flesh-burning ice. In the castle, magic may only be wielded while training, or if the castle is under attack from the wilds. That was an ironclad rule. As his thumping heart and ragged breath eased, his hand began to ache. He uncurled his bruised fingers. The gleam of fairy magic clung to the metal of the sharpened nib. Had the tiny weapon clutched in his fist inflamed his anger? "Why would they say such awful things?" Hazel asked in a trembling voice, clutching Will's arm. Since their father's disappearance, his confident little sister seemed always on the edge of tears. He put an arm over her shoulders. "They're envious men." I've heard people whisper things when they don't know I'm there," she murmured, looking at the floor as if she feared to see what emotions would flash in his eyes. "About you and Rowan not really being their children. About being her being a murderer, and hey," he hugged her, "don't listen to the things people say when they're scared and resentful. You did. You punched that man." "I did, didn't I?" "Are you glad you did?" "I am glad. I was angry, and it felt good. But I should have controlled myself. Mother and father have always told us the truth. Rowan and I had a different birth mother. She came to a tragic end in the wilds." "Was Daddy in love with her first? Before Mommy?" Will frowned. The subject of this woman he'd never known and felt no connection to always caused him to feel vaguely ashamed, as if thinking about her made him a traitor to the woman who loved and raised him and his siblings. "Haven't Mother and Father sat you down and told you this?" "No. I asked, but they say I'm too young." "If you're old enough to ask, you're not too young." "Will you tell me?" She looked so hopeful and so distressed as she bit at her lower lip. "All right, but just between us two." She nodded and leaned against him. Her hair, done up in the puffballs she favored right now, tickled his chin. He lowered his voice even though he was sure there was no one around who could hear. "Father and Mother both quested for years after they were chosen by the questing beast." "That's how they met and fell in love," said Hazel, with a flicker of her usual smile. "That's right, but they weren't always questing together. Often, they had to go their separate ways. Father himself says he went through a difficult time in the wilds, wounded and vulnerable. He met a woman who said she loved him, and for a while, he thought he loved her too. But people change their minds, or they fall out of love, or it wasn't really love at all. Or they've already met the person they're truly meant to be with, but just don't know it yet. Like Mommy and Daddy. Yes, like that. He wasn't really in love, but the woman had gotten pregnant and gave birth to twins. That's Ro and me. So he stayed, because that is the responsible thing to do. Then she was murdered in the wilds by foul magic. Tragedies like this happen all too often. It's why we fight the wilds. Anyway, what's important is that our mother is our mother. If they say nasty things, that's on their heads. She sighed, face pressed against his arm. After a long pause, she said in a very small voice, "Will Daddy ever come home?" "Of course he will," he said in a too forceful a tone. "Come on, Nat. Let's find Rowan." "I'm not a gnat." "Also, always buzzing at my ear?" "I'd miss it if you weren't." She wiped her cheeks, smiling just a little. But as they headed down the stairs toward the lowest level of the castle, he found himself spinning the soldier's words through his head over and over again. He'd never truly understand why his bold, decisive mother had stopped at 4 knighthoods when gaining all 5 would have given her the right to rule as High Queen, not just as his father's consort, however respected. It wasn't just that she'd suddenly had infant twins to care for, although it was just like her to immediately leap in to take care of an emergency she hadn't created. Even so, there were plenty of people she trusted, both in the castle and at her home village, who helped her raise her children. King Yorvo had granted her a knighthood at Garenbrig when Will and Rowan were about a year old, but the 5th and final knighthood, Embereth, had eluded her. Guinness Kenrith had finally completed the High Quest not long after Linden's return from Garenbrig. After he'd been acclaimed as High King, she'd not ridden out again, yet the idea that she'd given up, or that his father had dissuaded her from fulfilling the High Quest when they had accomplished so much of it side by side was both ridiculous and impossible. Had there really been room for only one, not two, ruling together? Or had the questing beast withdrawn its favor from Linden Kenrith for some other reason? Evidently, people in the castle were beginning to wonder. Or maybe they had always wondered but never had any cause to address it until his father's disappearance. The stones against his back quivered as a howl of wind chased down the many floors deep spiral of steps that ran from the top of the towering keep to a well sunk below ground level. He and Hazel hurried down toward the watchlight at the base of the steps, the lowest level. According to legend, the first human chiefdom had arisen on this spur of stone. With a crude fortification, the band had defied their elven overlords to lay claim to a scrap of solid ground for themselves. Down here was too deep even for the whine and shudder of the gale to reach, but he heard the muttering of an argument. He found Rowan in one of the armory storerooms, putting an edge on her sword. Titus stood in front of her, arms crossed belligerently and face creased with an imposing frown. Cerise had draped herself on a bench, a pearl-colored flame flickering from left forefinger as she rubbed her fingers idly together. Her gaze lifted to acknowledge Will's entrance, and she gave Hazel a nod, but otherwise she looked bored. "Hazel killed the blue fairy that snuck into the gallery." Cerise sat up with sudden interest. "They'd never dare if the High King wasn't missing." "Let's see it," said Titus in his usual bossy, skeptical fashion, but when Will opened his hand to display the nib, Titus looked startled. "You killed the fairy with your sling." "I did," said Hazel with a triumphant grin. "My friends and I will go hunting now we know they're inside. They won't have a chance against us." Rowan sat her sword down and came over to inspect the nib. "Good work, sapling." But Hazel's grin faltered as Rowan's expression darkened. "The wilds are getting bolder, but with father gone, the courts aren't coordinating their efforts to fight the rising tide of attacks. They don't respect the queen the way they ought, given all her accomplishments," said Will. "But that means none of this will end until we find father. That's why I'm going, and you're coming with me." "Going where?" Hazel asked. Will shook his head. "But Ro, did you forget? Today is our birthday. Who's to stop us?" After the exchange with the soldiers, he wasn't sure he wanted the date and thus the circumstances of his birth bandied about. "That's all very well, but there are proper ceremony to follow when a youth leaves on the first quest. Do you care about some hidebound ceremony? All these rules are made to control us." He rubbed at his head. Ever since their father's disappearance, Rowan had muttered and complained a great deal about the rules. Sometimes it did seem people cared more about what looked just and right than what actually brought about justice and peace. But at this very moment, the soldier's ugly words still ringing in his head and his knuckles still aching. He wanted to say, I don't want Mother to look bad by having us run off without a traditional leave taking. Yet he could not bring himself to say so in front of Titus and Cerise, even though they were his oldest friends. This is our quest, Rowan said. We are going to find our father. Plenty of people have been looking for months now, remarked Titus. What do you think you have that all those experienced knights don't? Knights like you? Rowan's sardonic smile was a challenge. Titus took in a rough, angry breath. Cerise hissed. Temper, Titus. Anyway, she's right. Titus exhaled. Very well. Very well what? Demanded Will. We'll all go, said Titus. Loyal friends forever, just as we pledged that day we fell in the moat and never told anyone. Children aren't allowed to climb the moat wall, announced Hazel with a look of alarm, followed by a sly pinch of her eyes as she contemplated what her siblings might have gotten away with. Have you really not climbed it yet? Rowan asked her. Hazel, don't listen to her, because it's very dangerous, and we were fortunate not to drown, said Will. Anyway, we can't leave because of the storm. All the better to go now, since no one will be expecting us to leave, said Rowan. Will, you have to come. I need you. And you need me. We can find him. I know it. Do you have a plan? Cerise asked, letting the pearlescent light of her healing flame wander down her forefinger to dance on her palm. Will said, We'd have to go to Vantress first. Titus rarely flushed, but when he did, he turned rosy with it. Do you honestly think 100 knights have not offered a secret to the magic mirror in the hope of being told where to find the High King, and been rejected? Yes, but I have a better secret. Cerise rested a warm hand on his arm, her touch bringing heat to his face. Do you now, Will? What would that be? That would be telling, said Rowan. She gave Hazel a firm hug, then gestured toward a neat pile of gear. Will, I packed for you. We'll go while the court is preoccupied with the latest disasters. Hazel can let Mother know we've gone, so she won't worry. She will always worry, because worry is a burden mothers carry with every breath of every day. They turned, startled to hear the Queen's voice from the passage. Lyndon stepped into the chamber, assessing the assembled gear in Rowan's defiant expression. She was alone, no courtiers treading at her heels. You can't stop us from going, cried Rowan, chin coming up. The Queen smiled dryly. I won't stop you from going, no more than I stopped myself when I was your age. The day I turned 18 is the day I left my village to test myself, to prove myself. I expect nothing different of you two, but I am sad you would have left without allowing me to say farewell. Rowan stood frozen for several breaths, then embraced her mother. Will heard a few telltale sniffles. From Rowan, of course, not from the Queen. He held back, allowing the Queen to give Cerise and Titus her blessing. Only when they had left the chamber did he say in a low voice, Before I go, I want to warn you. I've heard people talk about you. My dear Will, do you think I don't know what they say? But it is so like you to be worried about me. She took his left hand and tucked it between her own hands. Now, Kado is waiting at the postern gate. Please allow him to accompany you, at least as far as Vantress. Didn't he just return from searching? Is he not going to rest even for a day? He feels responsible for not being with your father that night. It's not his fault, nor so do I believe so. But he and your father have ridden many leagues together. They are loyal friends. Kado feels the weight of Algon's disappearance, most especially because it's clear a mage or a witch stole his shape to fool your father. Let him accompany you for his sake, maybe a little so for mine, so I know an experienced eye scouts your path. Not that I think you and Rowan aren't ready to go, because you are ready." She kissed him on the forehead in the comforting way she had done when he was little and feared bad dreams. Then she stepped aside with Hazel stifling tears beside her, so he could follow Rowan out of the walls that had shielded them for all their childhood and into the teeth of the unknown.